Hey guys, it's Nick. Welcome to another episode of T-Minds 365. Today's episode, we'll be walking through a Power Automate flow that will generate tickets in our PSA tool across all of our customers whenever a new risk detection event occurs in one of these tenants. Many of us are familiar with risky users or risky sign-ins if you have a customer on Azure AD P1 licensing, but many of us do not have the P2 licensing, which gives you more of those auto remediation capabilities. At our MSP, we really wanted to centralize the tracking of these events into a central ticketing system, which is our PSA tool, and that will allow us to help remediate these issues faster, along with giving us some central tracking so we can investigate how to maybe put more controls into place within these customer tenants, or even upsell the customer into P2 if we see tons of this activity going on within their account. So within this tutorial, I'll be walking through all the prerequisites, and then we'll step through the Power Automate flow together just so you can see all of the steps. As always, if this content's helpful, go ahead and like and subscribe. Otherwise, let's go ahead and dive in. Okay guys, so before getting into it here, we're going to start with some prerequisites. There is going to be a lot I'm covering today as well too, which is why I'm going to link below the blog post as well too, which documents everything that I'm going to cover and has some links for more information, because there's certain topics that I'm just not going to dive into as much for the sake of time. I'm going to make some assumptions that you already know certain things as well too within the Microsoft ecosystem. But getting into it here, we're going to start off with the application registration that you'll need using the secure application model. If you're not familiar with that, this is basically giving us a way to garner access tokens and make API calls using the Graph API within our customer environments. And that's ultimately what we're doing to grab the risk detections from our customers as well too. So within your Active Directory environment, within your own tenant itself, you'll go under the app registration section here. And I've already got one, but you can create a new app registration. And again, I'll link the steps for this below straight from Microsoft on how to set up the secure application model using this application registration. But at a very high level, what we're going to do in here is simply create the application registration, and then we're going to go under the API permissions, and we're going to add a couple here. One of which under the delegated permissions is going to be for contracts. So it's going to be related to our directory. Read write all. And then the other one that we're going to need in here as well too is going to be for the identity section for the risk detections. So we'll want to use the risk event, and you can do the read write all for this one as well too. And so you'll also want to grant the admin consent here for these to actually work. You do need to be a global administrator in order to be able to grant this consent as well too. So just take note of that. These are the permissions that we need though in order to garner the access tokens and generate the API calls that we're going to use in our application. You'll notice and want to grab in the overview section here your client ID, which is our client ID that we'll be using. And then you'll want to go into the certificate section, and you'll want to generate a new client secret. You can see I have one here that's expired. So you can put it in the description for it, and it'll generate a value here that will be accessible until you exit off the page. So you want to copy that and paste that into a secure location. Next, the other thing that I've done in here already that I'm not going to get into because I have a video on this is I've actually created a custom connector for my PSA tool, which is Synchro. And so you can see that here, and I've gone in and I've made the appropriate endpoints here for creating tickets and actually searching for customers, which is what we're going to use to generate the customer ID in the tickets so we can associate those properly. But again, you can check out my video on how I did that and maybe replicate it across other PSA tools if you're using one today like ConnectWise or Autotask. The other thing that I've done as well is I've created an Azure Key Vault to store my client ID and secret. We'll be using those to pull our client ID and secret for app registration in the Power Automate flow versus pulling those or documenting those in plain text. Just a better security practice. I'll link again below some documentation on how to do that if you're not familiar as well. This video is also assuming you have a kind of a base level understanding of the Power Automate workflow and APIs in general, just because it's going to be easier for you to understand. If you're very Genesis to that, this video might be a little bit harder to understand, but I just wanted to throw that out there, along with the fact that we're going to be using Dataverse as well too. Many of you are not familiar with Dataverse or may not be familiar with Dataverse or never used it, but it's simply at the end of the day a relational database table we can use here to basically create information and store information that's directly accessible via our Power Automate flow. And so one of our first steps here that we're actually going to do is set up this new Dataverse table, and we're going to set it up with all of our metadata as far as columns goes that we want to store our risky user events. This is a benefit twofold in the sense that we can see all this information, we can generate kind of a delta between what we're storing and what we want to generate as a new PSA ticket, but also you can use it for reporting in Power BI and things like that as well too. So I'd like to have both in there, but you'll want to create a new table and you want to call it risky users or something like that. And then with the primary column here, you'll want to change this to just ID. I don't like to call it name, and you'll have the schema name that we're going to reference later, but you'll just take note of that as well here too. Now here on this, we're going to go ahead and we're just going to start taking and creating some of the columns that we need as well here to document some of the information that we're going to use. If you're not, again, familiar with Dataverse, they have some pre-existing columns in here, but you can come up to the top, click on New, and click on Column. This is where we define the column name and the data type. So string, date, things of that nature. So in here, you're going to create these column names here that I'm going to designate, which is at first tier customer, because we'll want to designate the customer name. And then from there, we'll keep doing this with all the columns that we want to replicate. I'm going to put them up on the screen right now, and I'm also going to post them into the blog post for supplemental purposes as well. But again, just to save time here, you got to go ahead and just create a column for each one of these with the designation of the data type as well too. So I'm going to pause briefly and be back once I'm done. Okay, so I'm back here and I just wanted to show you an example. This is a table I'd already created for the demo purposes, just to show you what this will look like. It's got all of my columns here as far as everything I designated to you previously. This is what we're going to be dynamically populating as well too. Within the information, I obviously don't have customers or users in here just because I don't want to expose that to you, but essentially, this is the final output of what is going to be pumped into the table through our dynamic values that we're going to create in Power Automate. So with that, let's go ahead and pivot now into the actual Power Automate flow. So here under the flows, you click New Flow and do Instant Cloud Flow. You can give this a name here. I'm just going to call it Risky User Demo. And I'm going to manually trigger the flow here to start. We're going to change this once we're done to a schedule, but essentially here, this is what we're going to create here at the genesis of this Power Automate flow. Before we dive into the actual flow here, this is what we're going to be creating as a base level architecture. So we're going to use Power Automate to basically call all of our customers and get all their tenant IDs from Microsoft Graph using our app registration. Then we're going to loop through all of those customers and grab all of their risk detections within Microsoft 365 Azure AD. And we're going to populate those within the Dataverse database and table that we have just created. And from there, if we detect that the record in which we're creating based off of a unique ID, if it's new, then we're going to go ahead and create a ticket in Synchro and also send a Teams message as well too. Just wanted to show you two separate examples of how to do that. But essentially, you can also take this Dataverse table and you can create dashboard reporting with it in the Power Platform universe with Power BI or Power Apps as well too. So again, a lot of potential here, but just wanted to give a visual cue as to what we're actually going to be creating. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do here is we're going to create a new step and we're going to search for Azure Key Vault. And within the Azure Key Vault, we're going to use the get secret action. And I have, again, already connected Azure Key Vault as part of the prerequisites, and I've populated them with some secrets, one of which is my client ID. And then I'll duplicate this again here. And we're going to get a secret, and we're going to get the MS secret. So we'll just rename these as well. Next, what we're going to do here is we're going to call the HTTP action. And we're going to use a post request here to basically get a new access token we can use to get all of our customers. Now I pasted this in for simplicity, but essentially here you're going to reference this. And again, I have this in my blog to supplement some of this information that you can copy and paste versus having to read and type it in manually. But your tenant ID is where you're going to place your actual tenant ID for your partner account. And this is the token that we're generating here. We're using these headers as far as the content type. And then we're populating the body with the values that we have dynamically pulled from our Azure Key Vault. And so for this, I'm going to rename this to get access token. And then here we're going to go ahead and parse our JSON. So this is another operation we can grab. It's a data operation, and the content we're going to get is our body. And for the schema, you can copy and paste this in as well too, straight from my blog. But again, the schema you can generate from multiple sources, either from Microsoft's documentation directly, which again I'll link below, or even from calling this in Postman. You know, a tool like that is something that you can do. So we're going to rename this to parse partner token. And then the next step, now that we have our partner token, as part of this, it comes with this access token that we're getting from this API call we're making, and this is all coming from our app registration. So what we're going to do is make another HTTP request, and in here we're going to get our contracts call, and this is one of those permissions that we designated. Contracts basically just list every customer you have a delegated access relationship with or delegated admin relationship with. And so essentially here within the headers, what we're going to do is we're going to use the application JSON content type, and then we're going to use our access token that we're getting here from the parse we have above. So it's again a dynamic value that we're populating here in this particular section, and we're going to rename this guy as well now to get customers. We'll go ahead and click on new step. We're going to use the parse JSON functionality again. And here we're going to get the body dynamically from our get customers. And then you can use again this pasted schema definition that I have in my blog, or get this from the actual API documentation, which will also be in the blog as well too, or getting it from Postman if you're using Postman here to test some of these API calls. But here we're going to say this is the parse customers operation as well too. And then lastly here we're going to create a variable that is going to be dynamically set later for our customer name. And we're using this just basically to create a search with our PSA tool, which will become more clear once we get to that step. But in here, I'm going to call this the customer name. And this is going to be a string value, and we don't have to put in any value here just to start off with. So if you think about it here, we've gone through, we've got an access token, we have all of our customers kind of in an array here, and that array includes their name, their tenant ID, and things like that we're going to use here to basically make subsequent API calls for the risk detections. And so within there, we need a loop. So we're going to use apply to each control, and from the output, we're going to use the value that we have coming from our parse customers. And as you can see, we have these other things like their ID, their default domain name, and everything else that's coming from our call up here. So within there, we're going to do something similar here, which is we're going to get another token, but specifically for each customer. So what I want to do is actually copy this guy because it's very similar to what we need here. And in the My Clipboard action, you're going to select that, and I'm going to rename this to loop customers. And under this one, I'm going to say it's a get customer token because that's truly what we're doing. And then here, instead of your tenant ID, whatever you put in there, you're going to erase that, and we're going to put in this customer ID, which is technically their tenant ID. So we're going to be dynamically populating that to grab a access token for each customer, and we're still passing in the same value with our secrets here for our app registration, which will be the thing that's still getting us an access token just for a different customer environment. Again, same thing here. We can go ahead and copy the parse token value, and we'll rename this, and we'll say it's the parse customer token. The other thing we want to do here is that we want to go ahead and set our variable that we created earlier for our customer name. So we're going to say that, and we're going to grab it here from the drop down. And the value here is from our parsed customers, right? Because we're looping through each one. We want to set it dynamically each time. So we can say that this is the display name for the customer, which we're going to set. And we're just going to say set customer for this value. And now next thing that we're going to do here is we're going to use a method that I like to use for doing like a try catch block. So that is to say, like, this API call next we're going to make for risk detections in this customer environment may fail for a variety of reasons. You know, it may just be that Microsoft's APIs aren't working, or more likely it's because you have a customer that doesn't have a DP1 licensing. And so we want to properly handle that, otherwise this flow will continue to fail each time it hits that customer without that appropriate licensing. So within here you can use a scope operation or control, and I like to rename this to try because I like to think of it like a try catch block. If you're familiar with that within basic coding, whether that be PowerShell or JavaScript or whatever you might have been familiar with. But essentially in here we're going to go ahead and make another HTTP request. And this is going to be for our risk detections. So this method is a get. And within here, we're going to use this beta API call. Again, I'll link this API call for you. But in here, we're going to go ahead and we're going to do something similar like what we did before, where we're dynamically placing in the access token, and that's coming from our customer token up here, right? Because we want to get the information for this customer. And so the only additional thing that we want to do here for the queries is we want to filter our returned results for the risk state. Just because you'll get a lot of metadata that might be where you've already remediated things in the customer tenant. So we only want customers that are at risk or at a confirmed compromise state in order to basically then trigger this event and go through and get us the information we want to create a ticket. So we have our get risky users here. We're going to go ahead and parse JSON again. We're going to use our body from our get risky users. I'm going to rename this to parse risky users. And again, same thing with this. You can look up the API documentation. You can get it from Postman, you can get it from my blog. Schema definition here with all the dynamic values we're going to be populating into our ticket and a subsequent Teams message as well. So this is what I want to try. I want to make sure this API call returns some type of value, but we also want to catch any errors. So again, we'll grab a scope control. We'll rename this to catch. And we're going to configure run after, and we're going to say has failed skipped timeout. And within here, you normally would want to place something like maybe another Teams message that just says like this customer failed and place the customer name in there or something like that. But for the sake of time, I'm just going to skip over it for right now. Just know best practice would be to catch a message and either pump it into some log or send a message to yourself, or an email message to a group that allows us to kind of troubleshoot any errors that might be going on here with the API call. But so the final thing I'm going to do here is go ahead and do another scope, last one, and this will go ahead and we'll do a finally here. And this is again by default set to run if this is successful or hasn't timed out or anything like that. So if this actually does fail and there's nothing that goes on here, then this will actually run just fine. And again, if you do something simple like send a Teams message, it'll still go ahead and send that out and process, and then we'll get to our finally here as well too. But I want to make sure that I'm actually getting a value returned from our parse of the actual risk detections that we're getting here as well too, because it could be that there's no risky users and we get nothing back. So I only want action to be taken if there's the actual output from our API call. So within here, you're going to use a condition control, and we're going to see and rename this to check if data returned. And in here, we're going to use an expression, and this expression is called empty. And it basically allows us to evaluate certain values, but in here we want to evaluate the parse JSON or parse JSON. Yep. So we actually want to rename this. Meant to do that. That's why it was confusing me. So parse risky users is what I want to call this. And then here, we'll go back down and we'll say empty. And then for parse risky users, we're going to take out the value here as well. That's what we want to see, whether or not that's empty. And so if it is empty here, we technically just don't want to do anything. We want to move on to the next customer. And so if this also fails, it will be empty again as well too, just because it won't have that data output, and this will also just go into a yes, and then we'll move on to the next customer. So here we want to say this is equal to true, and then if it does contain a data value, we want to loop through each of the risk detections. So there may be multiple within this array. So again, we're going to use another apply to each. We're going to rename this to loop detections. And in it, we're going to populate the value that we're getting from the risky users. So just down all the way at the bottom, this particular value is what we want. And that's what we're going to parse through to see, and loop through each value to create new entries in our Dataverse table along with our tickets if they're net new. And so from here, what we want to do is use the Dataverse operation or connector here. We want to use the list rows because this will search through our table itself. And we're going to say, see if detection exists. And so for our table name, you can look up your risky user table. I'm going to use the one I had previously. And then for your filter rows, you'll want to use your primary ID here for your column name. So when I say that, back on our table here, you can go under the property section, and under the primary column, you can expand advanced options. And this logical name is what we're going to be searching for, because we're going to use this as our primary GUID or unique identifier to determine whether or not we've placed a new risk detection in our environment as well. So I'm just going to go ahead and paste that there, and we're going to use this OData query, which is just saying that we put in this EQ for equals, and then we're putting a single parentheses here. We're going to dynamically populate the ID of the risky user event. So this is the event that's coming back. This is a unique ID that won't change. We can monitor it over time, and it's also good so that we can populate our record in our Dataverse table as well too when we create that net new. And so we're seeing if this risk detection exists or not. So then we need another condition here. And within this condition, we're also going to do the same operation here with an expression of looking for if this value itself is empty. So this dynamically populates for you. You can just click OK, and then you're going to click true here to showcase that. And then from there, if it is empty, you basically, might not want to do anything. Otherwise, if it's a new record, we want to go through the process of adding it into our database and creating a ticket in the PSA tool. So the first thing we want to do is go ahead and add a new row using a Microsoft Dataverse operation. And so we're going to use our risky users. And sometimes you'll get that error just when it's loading. But then again, now we're going to start to populate our dynamic values. And so we want everything to come from our parse risky user JSON that we have. So we're going to populate the ID there, and then all this other metadata that we are using as well too, like the customer name. In this case, I have this labeled as accounts, or the user record, again, could be called contacts or something like that. But here you would want to start populating things like, hey, this is my customer name. You have your city, and these are all from the columns that you've created. And again, everything's going to come from your parse risky users. So all of these fields, I'm just going to go ahead and dynamically populate, and then I will be back once that's done. Okay, so I'm back here, and I've got my dynamic data populated. I used my variable for one, but then I just used the JSON coming back from our parse as well too to populate all these values into our table from Dataverse as well too. Quick note, if you did not want to use Dataverse and just wanted to make this stateless in the sense that you're making these calls and creating the tickets, then you can do this by manipulating something such as the date function within the Power Automate workflow. This allows you to call the current date. So you could reference the current date or current time with the value you're getting in the detected time, as far as this dynamic value we get from the risk detection event. You can compare those and say, well, if it's on the same day, then I want to go ahead and generate a PSA ticket. It's just another way to do this, because we'll start this on a cadence once we get everything moving. Now, once you're at this step, I think it's a good idea, and honestly before even, to start testing this in the sense that all of your calls are working okay, you're getting your access tokens appropriately, you're not getting any errors about the schema for any of your parses as well too. You likely want to do that while you're walking through, but I would stop right now and make sure this works, especially at this step, just simply because I don't think that you want to be creating potentially hundreds of new PSA tickets if these are all going to be net new. So the next steps we're doing is actually creating the PSA side of the house and the tickets that are generated. But again, I would run through and test this all the way before you get to that step. So you just have the delta coming through as far as the new detections go. But in this use case, I'm going to go ahead and click on my custom, because this is my custom connectors. And within here, I'm going to select the Synchro MSP. And I'm going to use my search function for Synchro, and this is just taking in a query and a content type. And so I'm populating my customer name here for the query. This works really well with Synchro. I have not had a lot of use cases where I can't find my customer, and so this is what I like to use just to get a customer ID, which you'll see here in a second. We're going to use this parse JSON operation again here. We're going to parse out our search body. And then from here, we're going to go ahead and again, grab the schema definition. You can grab this from Synchro's API documentation. You can grab it from the Postman environment. You may be testing Synchro, or from my blog as well too. We're going to rename this to parse search. And then from here, what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that we're returning a value, again, just like we've been normally doing. So another condition. I'll scroll over here. We're going to say empty again, and within these parentheses, we're going to look for the results, because this is what's actually containing anything within the API call from Synchro. And then if this is true, then you likely want to go ahead and again create a Teams message, create a notification somewhere, a log record of, hey, this failed, we couldn't find any customer for this record, because it's not going to do anything if not. So you want to go ahead and do that as a failover, but for the sake of time, again, this video is going to be long, so I just want to keep things defined quickly here. I'm not going to put anything in the yes, but essentially within this other operation here, you're going to say, I want a data operation. And within the data operation, we want a compose, which is going to give us the ability to compose a record. And here we want to extract the customer ID from our Synchro pool here, which is coming from our outputs. And so I'll, again, link this in my blog post. It'll be available there, but we're essentially going to use a different expression here, which is taking in this output expression. And we're going through our parse search, and we're just going through the body, then down into the results, then into the first record of the array, then into the table, then into the ID. And this is, again, just looking at Synchro's API documentation, understanding how the array is nested, and then just going step by step down until you get to that customer ID value here. So if this doesn't make sense, take a look at Synchro's API documentation for the search value, and this will make a little bit more sense once you see an actual return value as well. So we'll put that in there. That'll give us our customer ID. And so from there, we're going to use our custom connector again, and we're going to use our create ticket value. And in here, again, I set this up with these values as well too. The main thing that you want to do in here is we're going to use the outputs, so it associates our customer ID with our ID there. For the subject, you could just put new risky user. And then for the start at, I just like to use the expression of UTC now. And that'll just make the start date exactly the time of this creation as well too. For the problem type, this will be unique to you in whatever environment you are in. You can call it tenant administration, you can call it security event if you're using that within your PSA tool. It's obviously custom in that sense to your PSA tool. For the subject line, for the initial output, we're going to put new or risky user info. And then for the body here, you know, this is where you're going to populate all of our dynamic values as well too. So basically just everything that we had for everything coming through as far as the risky user detection itself. So a common example of this is, you know, typing in user and then doing the user principal name here for the user, just comma separating and moving down, and then, you know, doing all the rest of the values like this. So this is what's actually populated within the ticket itself. I'm going to pause briefly while I populate that, and then I'll be right back. Okay, so I'm back here and I've got all of our information. I just duplicated this once, so I'm going to delete that. And this gives us all of our detail about the risk event, the IP address, and then also the location, which is usually telling of a lot of signals, you know, if it's out of country or if it's, you know, in a location that's against the customer's primary location for work. So a lot of information we can populate in there. The only thing to note with this that I'm not doing that you should probably do, if you have your primary contacts in Synchro set up to a user at the customer site, you likely don't want to be sending these to them, so you probably likely want to designate a contact, unless that primary contact is somebody that's internal or a distro that you manage, like your MSP at support.com or something like that. Just to call out for Synchro, other MSP tools, or PSA tools I should say, allow you to designate a contact, so you just want to make sure you put an appropriate contact there, or make sure that it's not defaulted to a customer contact so they don't start getting these notifications. The last thing we're going to do here is go ahead and use our Teams connector. And within the Teams connector, we have an action underneath for posting a message in a chat or channel. You could do it in adaptive card if you really wanted to as well, if you're familiar with that. But I'm being simplistic here just to show an example. And I'm going to post it in a chat with myself. You would likely want to do it into a group of people or a team as well too, so you have more visibility. But same concept here, where we have the ability to basically populate these dynamic values. So you'll populate those and then just copy and paste it just for the sake of time again. But same as the ticket creation, just populating those events in there so you can see them visibly, and things like that too. So we're basically done here. We've set up everything. Obviously, what I would want you guys to do is test this all the way through and make sure everything's working accordingly. But this is giving you the ability to generate tickets in your PSA tool, just simply, changing up things and making it accessible via the Graph API. The only last thing that you would want to do is delete this section up here, just because once you're ready, you'd want to make this on a cadence. And so you can use a schedule action, and you can use a reoccurrence, and you can define the reoccurrence here. So it might make sense to start doing this just daily. So this runs, once daily. You might want to run this 3 times daily in order to generate these tickets. But at least that's giving you some time to, pull in the information and give your technicians time to investigate. There's other methods, that I'm not going to get into with this video that uses more of a webhook type of functionality within the Graph API, but it's a lot more complex, and I didn't want to get into that within this video. But this is all you'll do here, and you go ahead and save this up, and then this will loop through every time or every occurrence you have and loop through all those customers and spit out the output into a PSA ticket if it is new. Okay guys, that's everything I wanted to showcase as far as the tutorial goes. I have an example here which I'm showing, which is the Synchro ticket and the information that was generated in it as well too. And then over here, I'm showing you the Teams message that was sent as well too through Power Automate. So you can see it's pretty powerful just for central tracking and getting alerts sent to groups when there's new risk events detected. So you can further your investigation and also just increase your time to resolution on those events as well too. If you guys have any questions or comments, feel free to leave those below. And as I mentioned, I'll link my blog post below, which will supplement all the instructions that we went through today. As I mentioned earlier, if you guys want to see more content around Microsoft and the MSP space, be sure to subscribe. Thanks, guys. Have a great day.